welcome all to this session on driving forward zero emissions freight transport. My name is Mark Major. I'm a senior advisor with the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport. And it's really a pleasure for me to be invited to moderate this, this 1 hour session. Please, those of you that are joining and listening in, please do say hello on the chat. It's not easy for us to see, so I'm very grateful from Annette saying hi from Michigan and Bernardo saying hi from Madrid. So please do use the chat to introduce yourself, and please do use the chat to ask any questions. We're going to have two kind of input presentations to get this going, and then we will have a panel discussion between the 5 distinguished people who are addressing this problem from different aspects, but it will be interactive. So if we have good questions on the chat, this is your chance to ask questions to the Minister of Environment and Energy from Costa Rica, or to a manufacturer of vehicles in the UK, or to the Secretary of State from Argentina, or to Sophie Punta as an expert. So please use the chat for your questions. So we will have 20 minutes for these introductory input presentations, and then we will have 40 minutes for the discussion. So please, please stay with us and contribute your questions for the debate. So I'm really happy that we're having this session, because so often we spend all our time talking about passenger transport, and all the policy attention and focus goes into passenger transport, where actually freight transport is an important part of transport emissions, is actually a sector we can make progress on quite quickly. Lots of private sector actors involved in freight transport, lots of rational decision making on prices taking place. So it's a section we can really make progress on. So I'm really delighted we have this session. Of course, there's many aspects to this problem. There's the price signals question, there's the organization of supply chains, there's the logistics question, and the technology questions as well, and the public policy questions. So I'm really happy that we're going to be touching on these different aspects. We've been informed that Andrea Mesa Murillo, the Minister of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, has been slightly delayed. So we will still give her the floor to address us when she arrives. But I'd first like us to turn to Sita Holslag, who is an advisor on sustainable mobility with the Netherlands Enterprise Agency. And she's been supporting the work of the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance's working group, their community of interest on zero-emission freight vehicles. And she's going to talk to us about their work on how do we get more of these vehicles on the road. So without any further ado, Sita, you have the floor and you have 10 minutes.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you for inviting me to speak here today. Emily is going to put up some slides for you to have a look at while I'm speaking. And she said so before, but if you want to see them a little bit bigger, click on them twice and then they'll get a bit bigger. There's some text on those. So I don't know, Emily, are you okay with the slides? I don't.
Yes,
yeah.
it's just taking a second to load.
Okay. So while we're waiting for the slides, I think it's important to highlight one important part of this. So I'll be talking to you a bit about getting zero-emission vans and trucks on the road. I see Clarissa's here, welcome. And I do want to say that it's really important to decarbonize the whole of the freight transport sector. And zero-emission vans and trucks are only one little puzzle piece of that. And I'm very happy that Sophie is on the panel here with us, because I think she can highlight kind of a separate puzzle piece that is important within that. That said, I think it is important that we do focus on the zero-emission vans and trucks, because they are a large chunk of the emissions. Are we seeing the slides yet? Not yet, right? Okay, I think that would help to kind of.
Hi, Sita. I'm trying and it says it's still.
Okay.
Please keep going, Sita.
All right. It's all about improvisation. Yeah. So while we're waiting for the slides, maybe a bit more on this series of events. So getting the zero-emission vans and trucks on the road is actually a series of events. We've had 6 events so far, and it's being co-led by EV100, by Climate Group, CalStart Drive to Zero, and the Transport Decarbonisation Alliance. And what we're doing is we're organizing a series of events, which started with a kickoff in May, and then 3 regional events, one in Europe, one in India, and one in the US, kind of with regional local policy advice and ideas from manufacturers. And then we had yesterday our lessons learned event at Climate Week. And I'll use some of that, kind of wrapping this up and sharing the learnings thus far with you. So just moving ahead, I'll try to be as visual as possible while we're waiting for the slides. But there's some numbers here, and it's nice to see that in this pie graph, so I'll paint that picture for you. But if you have 4% of the global vehicles on the road, if you have the global vehicles on the road, only 4% of those are actually trucks. We have the slides. So if you can go to slide 3, Emily, that's where we are now. These 4% of the vehicles are actually using 36% of the fuel consumption and are responsible for 73% of the emissions. And that's the NOx emissions, but the carbon emissions are very close to that. So that's 62% of carbon emissions. So the main message of this slide is that there's a small amount of vehicles responsible for a big chunk of the emissions. So it's highly efficient to focus on that small chunk of emissions. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that the transition towards zero emission vehicles is happening in these waves. So the first wave, and again, double click if I know it's a small there's a lot of information on this slide, but the first wave is really the zero emission buses. And I would like to congratulate Andrea Mesa when she gets here, because I saw that the zero emission buses have also arrived to Costa Rica, I think this morning or yesterday. And the reason that that's the first wave is that they have this fixed route, they have overnight charging options, and there's a public procurement part in place that really helps move that market forward, because they're willing to pay maybe a little bit more for this first phase of the transition while the prices are going down. The second wave is where we see kind of the delivery vans coming up. And the third wave is where we have the bigger trucks. And David will be able to tell you a bit more on that segment also. And there's special interest in some niches. So for example, waste collection vehicles are also a specific niche. Those are very heavy duty trucks, but they have very local access, they're very local use. So that's also a niche that we see a lot of development happening. Then the fourth wave will be kind of the regional trucks, so in between cities, and the fourth wave is really the long haul transport that we see. So if we move to the next slide, we can actually step through that and go to the lessons learned so far. So the slide after that, where you really see this combination of regulations, cost parity, so incentives needed, infrastructure, demand, and the action happening in cities as a sort of magic mix of how to move this market forward. So I'll dive into them very briefly, each of them, just to give you a taste of what came out of this series thus far. So within the regulations one, we really see that a public announcement for zero emission is really key. So we see countries like Norway saying, all delivery vans have to be zero emission, all the new ones by 2025. For cars, we're seeing this around the globe, more and more countries saying, it's the end of the internal combustion engine coming up. And something like that for freight vehicles would really help the market forward. Complementing that is kind of a package of things. And it's important to state that it's really the package that's looking to be a success around the world. So we have in California, for example, these fleet purchase and sales requirements, which basically says that OEMs have to produce a certain amount of vehicles if they want to sell in that state. And then operators have to purchase a certain amount of vehicles if they want to operate in that state. That's policies that are coming. And they've distinguished between segments very much in line with these different waves, where each sector is going to be ready in a different time. And then we have the CO2 norms. So that's something that we see in Europe. And there's a revision coming up for that. So we're going to see if a combination of these two is going to move that market forward in Europe as well. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that cost parity is essential for scaling up the market. And I think this is just common sense. So it has to make economic sense in order for this to be really sustainable. We see that there's already a cost parity, so a good total cost of ownership for 2- and 3-wheelers. And this basically means that even though the upfront cost of the vehicle is still higher, the total cost of ownership, so the maintenance and the fuel, is actually already lower for the 2- and 3-wheelers, especially in India, where we really see this taking off. And for vans, that's also happening. The break-even point kind of varies from location to location, but the break-even point is there. But for the heavier segment, the heavy-duty trucks, that's still a bit tricky. So the upfront cost and the total cost of ownership are still higher than the diesel kind of competitive. And I'm very interested to hear about David on that maybe a bit later. But yeah, it's good to see there's movement there, and the race is really, starting to happen. But financial incentives will be needed for those upfront costs and to make that TCO work. Besides that, new business models are really needed. So we need to get away from this idea that transport is only for those that actually own a vehicle. Ideas like leasing and transport as a service are really models that will take off in the future. And another thing that we need to get rid of is the idea that transport is free. So it's a means to an end, and we understand that. But enable for front runners to be able to kind of invest in the technologies that are a little bit more expensive in the heavy duty segment, it's important to know that, transport isn't free and the margins there are very low now. So that's something to keep in mind when we're thinking about, how does this make financial sense in the future? Another thing that will need kind of new financial approaches is the infrastructure. So this public and private co-investment that will be needed, and kind of the systemic approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide, is something that will also, the vehicles need charging infrastructure, even if it's hydrogen or battery electric, both will need charging infrastructure. And that needs to be put in place. And there's a financial aspect on that. And the COVID recovery packages can actually offer a major opportunity for that. So if we move to the next slide where we see the infrastructure part, one of the quotes that I like to use, and I love that, is when they said, infrastructure is where worlds collide. And I think we can all see, the sparks coming off of that with electricity as the main one there. But it's very true. So it's really important that there's new collaboration between the policy, the private, and the energy sectors, and especially engaging with utilities. Because scaling up infrastructure, especially for the heavy-duty segment, is really a different ballgame than for cars, for example, because it requires a lot more power from the grid on specific locations. And at the moment, if that's put in place, the burden isn't actually shared equally. And it can be a big investment, especially if there's kind of grid upgrading needed there. So actual forward thinking now will save money in the future later. And having these tight collaborations is going to help with that. And I think that really ties in well with kind of the systemic approach of having this joint investment and this joint planning to have this smooth rollout of the infrastructure. So for the next slide, we see that demand signals are crucial. And signals are nice, but commitments are better. So we really urge kind of the front runners, and we see this happening with the EV100 members committing to purchase kind of a certain amount of vehicles in the lighter section, but we would really also like to see that happen for the heavier duty segment of the vehicles. And making zero-emission transport really part of the procurement helps, and that's what we're seeing. It works with buses because governments are putting it in the tenders that they're putting out there. And I think businesses have a large part to play while they're procuring their own transport services if they want to be a front runner in this. Having said that, companies can really start using the fleets that are already out there. So as the Waves model show, a lot of technologies are actually already out there. And for the sections that are a little bit further down the road, that's an opportunity for fleet owners and manufacturers to really co-create and meet that specific need. And the importance of real-life trials now is essential for the rollout later. Because with transport, in the end, you want the good delivered or the service. And the reliability is very important. So having, tested these things now will allow for kind of a bigger, faster rollout later. So that brings me to the last slide of the series, where most of these trials are happening, are within the cities. And having this clear vision of a city has a huge impact to attracting this also. We see this making a lot of sense because of the local air pollution. So as we said, these emissions are not just for CO2, but also for health benefits. And the cities will benefit highly from transitioning to zero-emission vehicles. And we see cities committing to that already. So 35 of them have already signed the Clean Streets Declaration of C40 to have zero-emission zones in place by 2030. And the Netherlands actually has plans to implement zero-emission zones for freight in their cities by 2025. So that's even sooner. And in India, for example, one of the cases that, one of the webinars that we had on that, they said the access restrictions are really the key for them to scale that up. So it's not just the zero-emission zones, it's also playing with access restrictions and making it more interesting for zero-emission vehicles to enter the city. Finally, from a technology and innovation perspective, it also makes sense. So if we look at these waves, those first 3 waves are really focused on city areas. So that's where the technology is ready already, and more ripe than kind of the longer distance ones. And I think in cities, it's really the power of the ecosystem. So you have these multiple actors, you have the front runners, and if they're motivated to work together on this common goal, you can really see that kind of taking off in the cities. So I know that's a lot of information, and feel free to ask questions. I see some familiar faces in the chat, so feel free to introduce yourself if you haven't done so already. But if we go to the next slide, that's just kind of the recap of what's the magic mix of what we've learned in this series so far. And the series isn't done. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that our next stop along the way is en route to COP, which will be a high-level event to kind of inform decision makers about what's needed and who needs to do what on the way to COP to really meet these climate targets that we all have. And that's it for me for now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out either to me directly or through the email address on the next slide, which is the TDA Secretariat. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Sita. That was a great kind of overview of the magic mix that you see necessary to make this happen. I think that's a really useful introduction. So I'm delighted that we've been joined also by Andrea Mesa Murillo, who is the Minister of Environment and Energy for Costa Rica. Welcome. In Sita's presentation, there's a number of things there: regulation, infrastructure, partnerships, the role of cities that are particularly relevant from a national perspective. So please, we look forward to hearing your perspective on how do we drive forward this zero emissions freight transport. You have the floor. Okay, we don't hear you, Andrea. I think you hear me, but we don't hear you. We see you very clearly, but we don't hear you.
So I had this problem earlier, and the audio selection to make is the last one. If you go to the wheel.
Yes, hi, Andrea. If you go to the settings wheel and click on it, then you can select
microphone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now it works, Andrea. Perfect.
Okay.
Sorry
Sorry.
for that. You're very welcome to join us. We look forward to hearing your remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, and sorry for that technological element. So I think that this combination of having clear policies from one side and clear goals on these is also a crucial element when we are trying to give clear and when we want to generate a specific commitments from the private sector. One of the elements that we have seen in our case is that once we publish our long-term strategy, our decarbonization plan with the specific goals on the electrification and transport, on elements that includes also actions around improving logistics, for example, these have generated a very good reaction from the private sector. And we are seeing elements around a specific pilot projects or initiatives, for example, from different companies. And we have the case of a good, of some food and beverage companies that are now analyzing how to change their light cargo freight into electric vehicles. But we have also seen some very good and interesting approaches from some big companies, cement companies and beverage companies on how to improve their logistics and are doing very good exercises on this transformation. So these elements of having clear policies, I think it's crucial. The element around procurement and tenders, of course, is a critical element, I will say. And I totally agree on the importance of including cities. Even in our case, where most of the transport legislation and regulations are centralized, and the regulations around transport are not, as in other countries, done by the cities. Once we have specific elements and commitments also from cities, we are seeing a lot of transformations and specific policies and projects moving around these. So I think that these elements, I totally agree, from the public sector to have clear policies, and in our case, again, long-term strategy and including these in our NDC and specific goals helps and give clear signals. Then, of course, working in the financial structures and how to support the different sectors in this transformation, it is critical. And I will say that it is the other challenge that we have and that we are working on right now, bringing on also the financial sector and how to work and elaborate a specific financial instruments for the adoption of this transformation is other critical element. And again, to include and to bring on the private sector, as we were saying, but also the governments. And I will leave it here. This combination is critical to encourage the transformation that we would like to see.
Thank you very much. Because of the success of kind of energy policy in Costa Rica, you have a lot of renewable energy. Do you have any particular comments about hydrogen? Do you see the potential for hydrogen and heavy-duty freight?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's something that we are also working on. Hydrogen, we see it as with a lot of potential. We have one pilot project of hydrogen going on in Guanacaste area. And there is a lot of appetite from different stakeholders to continue analyzing the role of hydrogen. In our case, we're working in the production of this green hydrogen, and there is a big initiative around that. And also we see the potential for the transport sector in this. So I totally agree. And as you were saying, in our case, yes, our electricity comes from renewable in more than 98%. So this is something that we have already covered. This is something that, you know, we have a check on this. But now it's how to electrify the transport sector in one way, but we also see the space for hydrogen. And I totally agree. that there is an opportunity there, and that, of course, we see right now there is a big discussion around the cost of the technology, but as I am confident that this will change in a few years if the hydrogen continues increasing.
Thank you very much, Minister Mesa. We very much hope you can stay with us for the next 35 minutes to listen to the discussion and contribute. You're very welcome. I'd now like to turn to Sophie Punter, who is the Executive Director of the Smart Freight Center. CETA, in her magic mix, and also Minister Mesa mentioned in her remarks, this question of partnerships and the private sector is key in this topic. We've seen a slew of new announcements from global companies. Yesterday, Walmart going zero carbon. We've had Nestle and Unilever in recent weeks, so global companies. You spend your time, Sophie, working with these companies. Can you tell us a little bit about the Smart Freight Center and how you work with these big multinationals on decarbonizing their transport?
Yes, thanks very much for joining. It's already a little bit evening here and it's past 21 September, so it's getting dark early. The Smart Freight Center is a global nonprofit organization that I founded in 2013, really because I felt that the freight sector is a commercial sector and because of that very different than passenger and transportation. And if we were to want to change this sector for real, we need to work not only on the policy side, but also on the commercial side. And what it means is that you're looking at freight buyers, or what we call shippers, and the freight suppliers, which are the carriers or the LSPs. And our role is then to guide these multinationals and work with them in developing and implementing their roadmap to zero emissions freight, and as well then do advocacy and awareness raising. So specifically how we help these companies, as I mentioned, we help them to develop and implement a sustainable logistics roadmap. And this roadmap really is 4 steps. The first one is where are we now, which is the calculating and reporting of emissions. And the second step is the set targets for emission reduction that can have interim targets, for example, by 2030 and zero emissions freight by 2050. The third step is then to implement solutions that reduce emissions, and those solutions can cover 5 types. You can look at the energy, the carbon content of the energy, like was mentioned, electricity, hydrogen, biofuels, etc. You can improve your fleet efficiency. You can improve how you operate your fleet, so to get higher filling rates, for example, and consolidating loads with other companies. You can optimize the modal combination, so shifting freight from truck to rail, for example. And finally, you can try and reduce freight demand. And it also is with you and I ordering online and perhaps picking it up at the nearest hardware store rather than having a van drive in our driveways. And with COVID, of course, we see much more relocation of production where the market is. So that's the third step, to look at those 5 solutions. And the fourth step is then collaborate. And here's where we're looking at procurement contracts that shippers have with carriers. How can they include conditions for giving the contracts, such as reporting emissions, or that the suppliers also should have a plan for reduction. But it can also include that the shipper says we're going to extend the contract with a carrier, not from 1 year, but to 3 years, so that this carrier is able to make the investment in an electric van or truck, because they have the certainty of a contract. So we're very much looking at it from the power of the freight buyer as a customer, but always in combination with collaboration. And for those 4 steps, Smart Freight Center works with industry and stakeholders to develop guidelines. The first one is then the GLEC framework, which is one methodology to calculate report emissions. We've worked with the Science Based Targets initiative to develop target setting guidelines for transportation, so not just freight, but also passenger. We've worked with the ALICE, which is a European platform, to look into different reduction solutions, and with the zero emissions freight vehicles action group, we're looking specifically then at electric vehicles. And on the procurement, we've developed procurement guidelines and a standard questionnaire that companies can use to check what they should include in their contract. And we've developed that with Business Networks, BSR, and World Business Council. And so we constantly find what is the next barriers companies face, what are existing practices, and then we we developed together guidelines and case studies to help companies overcome those hurdles. And I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sophie. It would be great if you could post some links in the chat so people can see,
yes,
learn more about you, the centre and the materials and these steps you're describing. But is it true? Are you seeing more and more companies coming to you asking for help?
Incredible. It's like a landslide now. In the beginning, we were really trying to convince people to come, and it was, really leading companies like DHL, HP, Heineken. You always have a few ones that are always there. Yeah, and you always see them. And now we're really getting companies, and I won't then mention names because I don't want, but now we're getting the companies that are normally not in the front row, but are starting to realize we can no longer get away without disclosing our logistics emissions. And now we're setting science-based targets, and there's almost 1,000 companies that have committed to doing that. I don't think we can get away with not including our logistics emissions. So these companies are really feeling, that it's like the early majority we're now, and it's a matter of time. And to make it easier, we also give training courses to these companies so that they can really in a practical way work on developing their own roadmap. And we're finding that we have not, so that's also changed. It's not just anymore the sustainability people. We now have in our training the procurement people, the logistics people. We even have communications people, and even people who normally lobby with policymakers, because they're really trying to figure out how do we go from a little bit of conservative approach in the past, where we sort of said, of course we want to have policy, but then give a bit of pushback, to almost the opposite way, whereby companies are thinking, we know electrification is coming, we know hydrogen is coming eventually. We might as well be part of the debate, because if we don't, we risk losing our business. So as that mindset has shifted, but the capacity of these companies is very differing. So a huge multinational like Unilever can afford to have a lot of staff working on it, and some of the smaller companies just don't have that either that capacity or the money to do that. So. Yeah.
Great, that's I'm sure for many of us that's really encouraging to hear this avalanche.
Very, and even the most conservative companies, yes.
That's great. So now I'd like to turn to David Thackeray, who is the Sales and Marketing Director for Teva. Teva is a UK-based manufacturer of electric freight vehicles. So David, you've been listening to this discussion from Sita. You've heard the comments from the Minister from Costa Rica and Sophie. How does this all sound to you? How is this looking from the perspective of a manufacturer? Okay, we don't hear you, David.
My apologies. As I was saying, I think the answer to your question is that it's sort of encouraging and exciting on the one hand, and deeply frustrating equally on the other. I guess from where we sit at Teva, a producer, as you say, of medium-duty electric vehicles, from, I guess in simple terms, 7.5 tons up to 18 tons. So that's the classic sort of urban delivery suite of vehicles, and we are going at full speed, as fast as the capital can take us, to get into serious and volume production. And I guess we are right now, we're targeting a position of having an annual output of 10,000 vehicles a year by 2025, which is a far cry from where we are today. And to echo Sophie's point, it is becoming an avalanche from the customer perspective. The phone rings off the hook, and the website inquiries just come thick and fast, and we're getting into a position where it's being difficult to respond to them all in an appropriately timely fashion. But at the same time, those same companies who are proactively coming to us and saying, okay, yeah, we've got a bid coming in. I had one yesterday, £750 million bid that they're doing for a highways contract, and they want electric vehicles, and can we do? And the answer is yes, we can. And can they have them some by 2022? Yes, they can. But the guy was saying, great. And then the debate quickly moved on to, okay, so how do we persuade all the stakeholders, internally and externally, that this sort of relatively young, scaling up, disrupting company can actually genuinely supply us at the scale that we need, even though that scale in that case is only a few tens of vehicles. How can they supply them in the right scale, support them in the right scale, warrant them robustly, et cetera, et cetera. And so we are, we're just as fast as our feet can carry us to get to that kind of scale. And 10,000 would be a great scale for us to get to in so many ways. But, and I guess this is where my environmental head sort of starts to overtake my commercial head. If we produce 10,000 vehicles, we are producing something like, less than 1% of the number of vehicles bought and sold annually, globally, less than 1%, which means that's significant less than 1/10 of 1% of those that are in service. I did a calculation a little while ago that said if we got 100,000 vehicles into service by 2030, we would have, we could chalk ourselves up for 1/10 of 1% of the IPCC's CO2 reduction goal, which is a bit demoralizing in terms of the scale of the mountain. And then on the flip side, we've got all the big incumbent mainstream manufacturers, the Volvos, the MANs, the DAFs and the Daimlers and all those big companies. And the hard truth is that as much as we're trying like hell to get this stuff done quickly, they can do it already. They can do it better than we can, and they're choosing not to. I was speaking, I'm not going to name the manufacturer, I'm not here to name and shame, but one of the major manufacturers has a 16-ton electric vehicle. And I was talking to a friend of mine who has a dealer franchise with that manufacturer. And I said, can you buy this vehicle? I said, can you order it? He said, yes. I said, and if you order it, when will I get it? He said, 14 weeks. And I thought, oh God, that's significant. And then I said, how much does it cost? He said, £400,000. Now, for the uninitiated, if you assume that that's in the order of 8 times the standard value of a diesel truck, what that's telling you is that the manufacturer in question, and they're not any different from all the rest, they've got the technology to produce these vehicles, they've done the engineering, they know how it's done, and they're choosing to put them to market at a price that is at least 3 times what is required to achieve a total cost of ownership parity. And going back to Sita's point earlier, in terms of the TCO isn't there yet. It isn't there yet at the moment because the big companies can produce but choose to price them out of the market. We can produce and we will produce at a cost. We have as many vehicles as we can build. We are supplying at around about 130,000 quid to achieve a TCO parity, and we can make a small margin on that, and that margin's improving. But we don't have the billions of dollars yet working on that to get to the scale that's required. So, you've got the governments and the policies bringing forward appropriate, regulatory frameworks. You've got certainly the main, or the larger sort of blue chip corporates starting to fall in line really, really effectively in terms of coming out and saying, yeah, we're going to be zero emission by this date, that date, or the next date. And then what they find is they come up against something of a brick wall in terms of vehicle supply. And I guess, we at Teva are doing our best to knock that brick wall of supply down as fast as we can. And I guess the more we achieve and the faster we achieve it, probably the faster the big players will feel the need to step in as well. So yes, I think you can clearly see that the trend is established, and it is becoming an avalanche. But at the moment, you've got a disparity, I think, between customer pull and supplier availability.
Thank you very much. Very interesting contrast between the kind of the reality of a startup new entrant experience and the incumbent power of the established industries. I think it might be an interesting question, how we support the transformation of these incumbent actors and their behavior. So now I'd like to turn to, we've been joined by Rodrigo Rodriguez Tornquist, who is the Secretary of Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Innovation for the Ministry of Environment in Argentina. Welcome. I know you joined us a little bit late, so you didn't capture all the conversation, but we've heard a lot about the role of governments here, regulation, infrastructure, stimulating the partnerships. So important role for governments. And I know that freight transport is a topic that you have paid particular attention to in your career, Rodrigo. So please, can you introduce yourself and explain to us what's happening in Argentina on this topic?
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you all. It's a pleasure. I want to thank SLOCAT to invite me, and it's a pleasure to share this panel with Andrea, Sophie, David, Emily, Mark, all good friends. In my position as coordinator of the National Cabinet on Climate Change, we are working closely with the transport sector in order to promote the transport decarbonization. Specifically in the freight sector, we are considering a package of options for promoting decarbonization. Of course, the first one is to promote energy efficiency. We adopted 2 years ago a program inspired in the Smart Way program in the US, tailored to the Argentinian needs and capabilities. That is called Transporte Inteligente, not very innovative. It's all actually the same, but in Spanish. And specifically, we are working closely with the transport sector and the energy sector, since we understand that these are two faces of the same coin. And considering that, we are considering a broad spectrum of vectors of energy. First of all, trying to transition to biofuels. We have many companies that are using 100% biodiesel on their fleet, and it's working quite good, since we have a very good potential for agricultural production. Is a good option. Also, we are working hard in promoting CNG and LNG for both buses and trucks. And we are starting to explore the potential adoption of hydrogen as a fuel for trucks specifically. Considering the electromobility, I think that is a good option for urban mobility and for last mile, since some companies are adopting electric fleet for mailing and for last mile. But it's relevant to consider how the last mile increased its participation in the non-motorized modes, as bikes, like Rappi, Glovo, this Uber Eats, both for foods and for any kind of packages. We've in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, 14 million inhabitants, we've reduced our transport activity in 50% during the pandemic. And the good news is that the streets are clearer than before, and many people dare to use the bike. Of course, because it's also more safe in terms of the contagions of the COVID-19. And many people is using the bike, not only for personal mobility, but also for moving goods. This is absolutely new in Argentina. Also, as part of the strategy for the, we are working hard in promoting a freight transport from road transport to waterways, specifically for the agricultural sector, and for railways. So for agricultural sector, as you may know, Argentina's production is agricultural production is 150 million tons a year, and less than 20% is moved by train. Like we have a big participation from the road transport. There we think we have a good opportunity to decarbonize. Just to close, we think in the last months that the pandemic triggered a lot of actions and activities from the private sector in order to promote energy efficiency and decarbonization in the private sector. Yesterday, we had a meeting with the biggest chamber of private sector freight transport companies, and they are working very hard in make these changes now in order to integrate this agenda in the economic recovery post-COVID. So we think it's a good opportunity for promoting changes in our sector. I think you are muted.
Thank you, Rodrigo. That's great to hear what's going on in Argentina and to know you're working so seriously on these topics. We look forward to following the progress of that. So with the 10 minutes that we have left, I'd like to come back to you each with the last question. And I'd like to do that in reverse order. So Sita, then David, then Sophie, then Rodrigo, and then Andrea Meza. And ask, you mentioned it, Rodrigo, we're now in this post-COVID situation. What opportunities do you see, either in the post-COVID recovery or more generally? What opportunities do you see to drive forward this zero emissions freight transport agenda? So please, 2 minutes each, starting with you, please, Sita.
Thank you, Mark. I was reading the question Thomas was posting in the chat. So could you repeat the question to me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can. So I was asking, in general, I'm asking all of you, what do you see as the principal opportunity for driving this agenda forward, either in the post-COVID context or generally? You've only got 90 seconds left now.
Oh, sorry. So I think this setting the ambition and then really taking the concrete action. So setting these target dates, both companies, cities, countries can really do this, and including freight in those target dates, but then also measuring that. And I think that's where instruments like the GLAC framework really come into action, because we've seen a lot of greenwashing, I think, in the past, and now it's, we can't get away with that anymore. So I would say that would be my main point in my 90 seconds.
Thanks very much. If you've got some examples, good examples of targets, it would be great if you could post those or pointers to them. That would be great to see.
Yeah, I think there's more.
David.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah. I think two things.
Go to David now.
Yeah, for me, I think there are two things. The first is that I think one thing COVID has done is it has it's given the public a different perception on what government can and needs to do in the face of a really massive crisis. And I think there is starting to be an effective bit of narrative around, hey guys, if you think COVID is bad, climate change is going to eat COVID for breakfast, and COVID is just the hors d'oeuvre to the big main course. So I think it's sort of emboldened governments to take drastic and radical actions, and I think it's given populations a sense of actually sometimes that's a good thing for governments to do. So I think that's one of the opportunities. And the other one, which is perhaps not particularly related to COVID, but maybe just more general, if you look at the capital markets today, the amount of capital that is starting to flow in to, I suppose, next generation mobility, not all of it being successful. We've all heard the stories around Nikola of late, I'm quite sure. But, we are looking at, many organizations coming in, the kind of billions of dollars. And this is a multi-billion-dollar game to get to scale. But the capital does seem to be coming forward, particularly in the US. So I think the combination of improved availability of capital and emboldened governments in the face of big issues give us an opportunity.
Thank you very much. Sophie, where do you see you've been working on this for a long time. Where do you see the opportunities now?
Yeah, I wish I could say 10, but I'll pick 3. The first opportunity is disclosure. Now that we've got one methodology, the GLEC framework, this is even going to be the basis for a new ISO standard. It's a matter of when, not if. And I think I wish that governments would be bold and start pushing, moving from voluntary disclosure to maybe not legally mandatory, but certainly like, if you want to do business with us as a government customer, we expect you to disclose. Yeah. So give that thing. Secondly, I think is the similar market. The market demand needs to be clear for zero emissions freight. And it's more than just electric trucks. That is solutions. So what we're working on with BSR is what we call a Sustainable Freight Buyers Alliance, whereby the one thing that's missing right now worldwide is that there's one single common market demand for zero emissions freight across the board by big freight buyers. And if all of them were to say this is what we want, then they can subsequently implement their actions through the various initiatives that already exist. So it's almost like the roof on the house is missing. And the third one that I think is really key is money. And I think that a novel idea that we're at the moment exploring and will come out with a white paper on that next month is carbon offsetting inside the transportation sector. So rather than planting trees, let companies that want to offset their freight emissions put money in schemes that take old trucks off the road, that allow cities to help small carriers buy electric vans so they can replace the diesel vans. If we are able to translate the growing desire of companies to offset any remaining emissions that they're unable to reduce themselves by investing inside the transportation sector, I think we can unleash an enormous amount of capital that's currently lacking.
Sophie,
and governments can help. We need governments here to help to set up such schemes. But
thanks, Sophie. That's a great example. Do such schemes already exist, or it's a proposal you're saying?
Yes.
To setting up such a scheme?
No, it exists for cooks. It exists for cooking stoves. So we're already, and I'll put a link from that one as well. But it exists. So it's about how do you translate this? It also exists for renewable energy. The certificates. So these schemes exist. They've just not been translated to transportation just yet. But it's
great
it's possible.
Rodrigo,
my turn.
What do you see as the
almost, Mark? So if Rodrigo allows me to jump in,
please.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Three remarks here. I will say recovery plans. We are mobilizing a lot of public money in the recovery plans, and we need to prioritize certain investments that are linked to this transformation. So prioritizing investments in charging infrastructure, in contributing with the development of hydrogen. Elements like this, I will say, can be a good opportunity in this sense. Of course, carbon pricing policies and elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. I think that these elements will give clear signals, and it's a very good opportunity. In most of our countries right now, we are in conversations with most of the development banks, with FMI, with all these, because as you know, we are facing a very difficult times in our economies.
but at the same time, it is where we need to implement coherence in our policies. And I think that if we prioritize investments aligned to this transformation, if we also implement carbon pricing policies, and if we eliminate subsidies on fossil fuels, I think that this also, it's a very good contribution to this package in this situation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for joining us. Much appreciated. Rodrigo, you're going to have the final word here. Where do you see is the opportunity?
Thank you. I will try to be brief. First of all, I think that the first opportunity is the uncertainty we are facing. We don't know what's going to happen next year, but we know that the big paradigms that were too big to fail, like just were melted in front of us in a couple of months. Like some changes that was no, there's no way to change that because we worked this way in the last 5 decades. In 3 months, we're gone, and that gives us an opportunity because the only tool you have in front of uncertainty is innovation. So we all understand that we need to innovate, and we all need think. At least we from the national government think. We don't need to green the economy. We need to make it more human. We need a new development model since this market that the pandemic is showing is not one part of the system. It's the whole system that is not working. I'm talking about poverty, inequality, and environmental externalities. So a new model for development is needed, and a new role for the state is needed. As Andrea mentioned, the recovery package mostly promoted and funded by the national governments. How? Well, printing money. Okay, we need to think what is the sustainability of that tool. So we need a social contract on that. And second, the second opportunity, I think that there are some new stakeholders that are arising: youth and financial sector. Sorry, youth is moving the society, and people are like starting demanding the producers, to have a different responsibility and to understand what's behind that product. How was it transported? How was it produced? And what are the environmental externalities of that product? On the other hand, the financial sector that is starting to increase their environmental and social and governance standards in order to allow the operations. And those are very good drivers to promote change. So we think that in the future, but we need to innovate and open our minds and think outside the box.
Thank you very much indeed. From a number of you, considerable signs for optimism and hope. So I mean that's great. Now it's time to bring this session to a close. I've been very happy that we managed to bring together a mixture of experts, manufacturers, and national policymakers. That I think was very rich. My colleagues have been sharing in the chat a number of links and hashtags if you can to find out more information and to follow this discussion. Please take advantage of those. And remind you again of a major event that is being organized for the whole transport sector en route to COP26. Many of you will know that the climate conference has been postponed 12 months until the end of 2021. But the transport sector can't wait an extra 12 months to advance these discussions. So we're hosting on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of December, globally, these kind of discussions on many topics. and they will be available whether you're in Argentina or in Fiji or in China. We'll be doing sessions around the clock to advance these discussions. So please look out for En route to COP26. It's mentioned there, and join us then to pick up these discussions again. We will certainly be having a focused discussion on zero emissions freight transport, and hopefully be able to take this discussion a step further. So thank you all for your participation. I hope it was useful for you. Thank you to my colleagues, Emily Hosek and Chris Decky behind the scenes that put this together. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everyone.